This is Don Frederico. Earlier this year, I interviewed Boston IP attorney Chinh Pham, a former colleague of mine who is currently the president of the Boston Bar Association. At the beginning of the interview, Chinh told me the remarkable story of his family's rescue from Saigon in 1975, in the final days of the Vietnam War, and his recent renewed contact with the American naval personnel from the U.S.S. Duluth who rescued them. I held that exciting portion of our conversation for this separate bonus episode of Higher Callings. Enjoy! Let's start in those early years, because you were telling me the story of how you and your family came to the United States. And I just found it so compelling. And I know you've told that story in different formats and in different audiences before. But I'd love to have the podcast listeners hear about your story. I know you were 10 years old at the time that the United States military evacuated South Vietnam, and your family lived there. Can you go ahead and just narrate a kind of a short version of that story?
Sure. For those in the audience who may not know, but the Vietnam War ended in 1975, and officially the war ended on April 30th, 1975, the day that Saigon fell. So that's the day that my family and I left Vietnam. Prior few days to that, Vietnam or Saigon was really under a 24-hour curfew. And my dad, because of his education, knew that he was going to be, he wasn't going to be treated well. So he decided that, he wanted to, that he needed to, I should say, take the family and leave Vietnam. We had no idea where we were going. We just knew at the time that the Americans, the Australians, the French, and some of the other countries were out in the South China Sea, the Pacific, and our goal was to somehow make it out there. So my dad had a couple of friends at a naval base, and he was able to get us into the naval base and onto one of the 3 river patrol boats. If you can imagine the movie Apocalypse Now,
Sure.
the one of those river patrol boats. So we were on one of those 3 boats, and we actually left the night of the 29th. But the events were just so bad that we went back to the base, waited out for things to calm down, and left the next day.
And again, you were 10 years old when this was
I was 10 years
right?
old. Yes. There's a lot happening, but I'll just highlight some of the interesting things that happened on that journey.
And by the way, just to set it a little more,
Yeah.
Not only were you 10 years old, but you didn't speak any English.
Correct. I didn't speak English. Fortunately, my parents did.
Okay.
And so, but I, had no idea. I mean, I knew they spoke French because they were Vietnamese. So, but English, I knew my dad, but my mom, I was surprised actually to hear her speak English when she did start speaking English. But we left and went down the Saigon River, and there were 3 boats in the caravan, but at some point one of those boats got separated. And long story short with that is that that boat actually made it out. When we came to the U.S., we found out that it did make it out. So that was good news. But once we got to the Delta and we were about to hit the Pacific Ocean, we knew we had to hook up with a bigger boat, right? That was seaworthy. And so we were able to track down what I call maybe like a I don't know, maybe it was like an oil frigate or something a little bit bigger, right?
Okay.
We got to the boat, and then my brother, he's a year younger than me. He decided to jump on to the other boat first before anyone could say anything. He decided to jump on, and then the captain of the other boat decided not to allow us to come on, and he took off with my brother.
Oh,
on that boat. And
great. With
so
your 9-year-old brother.
he was a
And
90,
by the
yes.
way, while all of this was happening, was there still fighting going on
Oh
back
yeah,
on
absolutely. There
was
was
it
still
going on
fighting.
around you, or was it back on the
Yes. I
mainland?
mean, we're on the river, right? So fighting is happening on the shores there. But yeah, we were able to manage to catch up to that boat, and that captain finally allow us to all come on. And then we got
Was that an
uh,
American boat?
no, this is Vietnamese.
That's a
And so
Vietnamese. Okay.
yeah, so we were on there. I would say, you know, probably 100 or so people on this little boat. I just remember my parents had the foresight to bring with them, my mom actually, some medicine to help with all the sickness, the seasickness and what have you. And
She had
people were,
worked in a hospital in
yeah,
Saigon,
she
right?
was a nurse, and so that was really helpful. But we got out to the Pacific, so we left on the 30th. Think we got out to the Pacific probably on the first or so, and we were just floating out there, hoping someone would pick us up, right? And I just remember circling around this big ship that had a big number 6 on the side. It turned out to be the U.S.S. Duluth. But what's interesting is that as we were circling the U.S.S. Duluth, that American ship would send out like a couple of parties to kind of gauge who's friend, who's foe before they decide to pick us up. And once they got to our little boat, as a friendly gesture, the people on our boat gave them all of the guns on our little boat. The Americans took the guns and then they took off. And we're all left scratching our heads like we thought we were going to be rescued, and then the Americans decided to take off. But fortunately, they did return later and they rescued us. They brought us up onto the USS Duluth.
Which was what kind of ship?
It's an LPD-6, which is a ship that carries amphibious vehicles like beach landing vehicles,
Okay.
things that you would see like during what Normandy invasion, right, with where the troops were transported onto shore there. So that's a boat that had a lot of those amphibious vehicles,
Yeah.
there. So we were there. We got onto to the ship. I just remember having to climb on the side, up these ladders on the side of the ship, as the ship was just bobbing up and down. And if you can imagine, it's pretty high up, and
Yeah.
you're 10 years old. It's pretty darn scary. And
Yeah.
so I just remember telling myself, just don't look down, just look up, and just walk up. Don't look down, because if you do, it's not going to be pretty, right? And so we got up to the onto the ship, and they directed us up to like the third level, the very top level, and that's where my family kind of pitched camp for the next few days.
Hmm.
What was fortunate for us was that we got hit with like storms, like rain, and it was just typhoon like
Wow.
storms. Like, and being on the top deck there was very fortunate, because all the downpour was just kind of go down to the next few levels, right? So we escaped all of that. And after a couple of days, so we got picked up on the 2nd of May.
Okay.
um and it was the last day of Operation Frequent Wind. So the Americans had about 18 ships, kind of situated out in the South Pacific there, in the South China Sea, just looking to pick up Vietnamese who were leaving Vietnam. And so we were just fortunate, because that was the last day they picked us up, and that was the end of the operation, right? They
Yeah.
left. All the ships left. And so we were taken
How
to
did they treat you on the ship?
they were very, very kind, right? But they didn't know what Vietnamese ate.
Yeah.
So uh,
They
and
didn't have the
and so
Vietnamese cuisine ready for you when you got
no,
there.
no, no, exactly. They had cooked for us for a number of meals, just essentially rice porridge with Vienna sausages. And so I can still taste the Vienna sausages,
Not sure I've ever seen
but
that
but
on a
it was
menu
food,
anywhere.
right? And but we were just grateful
Yeah.
to have been rescued.
Well, I'm glad they treated you well, and I'm not, of course, I'm not surprised. But I'm glad the experience was good for you, at least in that respect.
Yeah, and what was interesting was, you know, couple of years ago when we visited Duluth, I started corresponding with one of the crew members who actually told me he was on that third deck standing guard right by where we were situated, because I described clearly in my little story where we were situated. And he said, I know exactly where you were. I was standing right there. And he apologized for basically having a gun right next to our family. It was
Oh,
very, and we're looking to figure out a way to kind of, get together perhaps at a future reunion of the USS Duluth Crew Member Association.
yeah.
So
You and your family were rescued by, I think it was the Seventh Fleet of the U.S.
yes, the
Navy.
USS Duluth was part of the U.S. Seventh Fleet.
Okay.
We were taken to Subic Bay in the Philippines, then flown to Guam,
Hmm.
where we were processed. And after about 5 days, we were flown to Arkansas, where we were situated at a refugee camp in Arkansas.
And that was at a military base,
It
Fort
was, it
Chaffee,
was,
I think it was
yeah, Fort
called.
Chaffee, yeah,
Chaffee.
in Fort Smith, Arkansas. So that camp subsequently was used as a place to accommodate a lot of the Cuban refugees back in the 90s.
Okay. And you were there for how long, Ching?
I was there for 3 months, and my dad, there were families that left fairly early. Thing was that if you wanted to leave, you had to get a sponsor, and then that sponsor will work with your family to help you acclimate, assimilate, and so on and so forth. So my dad said, we're not leaving the camp until I could find a job. So he finally located a job with he's a chemical engineer.
Yeah.
He got a job with a company in Des Moines, Iowa, and that's when we left the camp and we moved to Des Moines, Iowa.
You had
My first case
sponsors.
of
You
yeah.
had sponsors there in Iowa?
Yes, it was a church that sponsored us. And so yeah, no, life couldn't have been, you know, much, oh, I should say it was very different, right, than what I was used to in Saigon. If you can imagine, Saigon in 1975 was a city of probably 3+ million people,
Yeah.
and to go to Des Moines, Iowa, where there were approximately 200,000 people, it was a,
Yeah.
a
Yeah. I've
huge
been to Des
difference.
Moines. I've never been to Saigon, but I've been to Des Moines and I know how small and quaint and,
Yeah,
pleasant a town it is.
yeah, it is, still is. Yeah, you know, people in Iowa and generally in the Midwest, I think are very friendly, and I
Yeah.
think we were very fortunate to have landed in the Midwest as the initial you know starting point for our lives in the U.S.
Well, it's a compelling story. I,
Yeah,
I,
yeah,
I at least am one person who has never heard the story from the point of view of the rescued refugee. So, thank you for sharing that. And then just to kind of cap this off, years later, there was a museum, I guess, at some point created in Duluth,
yes,
Minnesota, for the U.S.S. Duluth, and you
yes.
had heard about it, and then
So
you,
it's an interesting story. I mean, it's
yeah. Why don't you
just
tell that just briefly?
yeah. Once I had kids, right, I would start telling them the story of my journey from Vietnam to the U.S. Just as a bedtime story, right?
Yeah,
And you know got to a point where if I leave out something, they would remind me, Dad, you forgot this. You need to go back and tell me about this. But my wife thought it was a really interesting story, and I needed to memorialize the
hmm,
story. And so I started writing this down, and that got me to thinking that there's a lot of gaps. When I was doing that, and so I started doing research, and periodically, I just go on various website and do some research, and I would visit the USS Duluth website because that was the ship that rescued us. And July of 2019, I saw that the Crew Member Association was trying to raise money to build a museum to showcase all the artifacts from the ship. The ship had since been decommissioned and scrapped, right? And the artifacts are now being kept and displayed at a temporary museum in it's the St. Louis County Historical Society in Duluth, Minnesota. And so the crew member association, they were selling these bricks to support the fundraising effort. So I bought one, and I had a little inscription written on there was, rescued May 2nd, 1975.
Yeah.
I'm tearing up here as I'm trying to remember the
Oh,
story.
gee.
And so literally the next day, the president of the the U.S.S. Duluth Crew Member Association reached out to me and said, we've never come across anyone that we've rescued since 1975. So you can imagine it had been 44 years, and I was the first one that they'd
Wow.
come across. And so he immediately, started, talking to me, trying to figure out how we can reconnect my family with the ship and with some of the crew members. And long story short, he said, let's invite you out to Duluth, Minnesota, and why don't we have you meet up with the mayor and then create this whole day for you to kind of visit the various sites. Once we showed up in October of 2019, right after I ran the Chicago Marathon, I didn't realize what was going to happen, but essentially we met with the mayor, and then she had a press conference. They had the newspaper, the TV stations, it was all there, and the mayor declared October 15th, 2019 as the Pham Family Day.
Isn't that
very
great?
touching.
Who went with you? Who went with you?
So yeah, it was my parents,
Yeah.
my sister, and my wife, and then also the individual that sponsored us in Des Moines, Iowa. So he was 28 years old back in 1975. He was a lawyer.
Yeah.
Grew up in Acton, Massachusetts here,
Oh, really?
but went out to Wisconsin for college, and then moved to Des Moines, Iowa once he met his wife in college there. But we reconnected back in 2012 because his dad passed away, and I was invited to attend the ceremony at the Bourne Cemetery because his dad was military. And then we found out that we both loved running, and so he came to Boston, I think, in later in 2012 to run the Boston Marathon.
Yeah,
with me.
great.
And then we've been in touch since, right, because of our love of running. That was a really interesting day. We ended up just visiting a lot of the memorials dedicated to the U.S.S. Duluth, and then just had a wonderful time meeting the people, getting to know a lot of the crew members that showed up. And I have two things about the visit with the crew members. I have to say is that my mom walked up to this one individual and just said, "I remember you."
And that was from 44 years? This was 44 years later.
ago. Turned out he was the guy. He was the guy that pulled us from our little boat.
Really?
onto the U.S.S. Duluth. He was one of two people that was designated to go out and rescue the Vietnamese.
I guess that's the kind of person you don't forget over the years, right?
Yeah, and so he was really touched when he heard that my mom, when she told him that she remembered him.
Good for her.
And then the other piece of this during the visit was I just happened to recounted the story of how the crew members from the U.S.S. Duluth just took our guns and took off.
Yeah.
And sure enough, one of the officers from the U.S.S. Duluth was in attendance, and he told me the reason why. It was his decision to basically take the gun, right, and then he had to assess whether or not we were friend or foe.
Sure, he had to protect his crew.
Exactly. And so initially it was just to make that determination. Once they felt that we were friendly, he sent the team back and took us onto the U.S.S. Duluth. So really, really interesting opportunity for me to kind of tie up a lot of the loose ends.
Yeah.
Especially when you were a 10-year-old and you're looking and you're seeing all these things and you had no idea what was going on. And my parents, they weren't, I don't think they were really focused on that. They were just trying to figure out how to get rescued and survive, right? So
Sure.
I had the luxury of just kind of observing a lot of things. So a lot of things I brought up to my dad, and he said he doesn't remember, but he was glad that I do. Yeah, I did remember a lot of those things. So
good.
This has been an episode of Higher Callings. Your host is Donald Federico. Music is provided by Fancy Mountain, and our logo was designed by Matt Pedro. The associate producer is Brian Federico. Higher Callings is a production of Federico Media, LLC.